Welcome to the last session of this week's webinar series. Today we'll discuss children's rights or child labor in particular. It's quite an appropriate day since it's International Human Rights Day. So the title we've given this webinar, Children's Rights are Human Rights, is not chosen coincidentally. The webinar will be held in English. Because we have a foreign speaker. Do not hesitate to ask your question in Dutch if you feel more comfortable with it, and I will try to translate as best as I can. Today we have three speakers. Well, the first speaker is me, which is also your moderator, and we have the pleasure of the special guest Akkie de Kort, who will introduce herself a bit later on, as well as Stina Nilsson. Very, very special welcome to you guys. And I will just introduce the subject shortly. And introduce the program as well. So I will just be talking a max 10 minutes. Then we'll start with our interview with Akkie de Kort and move on to an interview with Stina Nilsson, and we'll end with a Q&A. We're going to actually start maybe with a small poll today, because as the title suggests, children's rights are human rights. We wish to know that how you feel kind of about it. Is it sufficient, but are children's rights sufficiently covered by the universal human rights, or maybe not? So it's a true or false question. So if participants I can see the first coming up. I would say it's false. It's not. Of course, human rights are children's rights as well, but children are often overlooked in the process. Plus, they're more vulnerable. They have age-related needs, and they have a right to development that is unique to children. That children's rights are actually need some special attention, as part of the reasons that I just mentioned. And we have actually, as part of the Covenant Agreement, worked out a whole framework regarding children's rights that actually provide tools when you embark upon developing policy related to children's rights. It elaborates on which criteria you can employ and what this means for your due diligence steps. So today, I will only very, very briefly touch upon what is mentioned in the framework. So I do encourage everyone to go to the website of the Pensioenfederatie, because we can find the framework there. It's actually also available in English. So if you wish to or prefer to have the English version, then you can contact me. So before we get into the child labor subject with our speakers, I just want to emphasize that this is only one part of children's rights, because the rights of children can actually be negatively impacted through a lot of other themes as well. You can think about climate change, environmental pollution, even tourism, or special targeted marketing can affect children. And children's rights were actually first enshrined in the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child in 1989. And 196 countries are party to this treaty. And the Netherlands actually signed a few years later. In the meantime, the UN guiding principles were established, which kind of led to a need to develop some kind of tool. So how do you combine the children's rights as defined by the UN Treaty and the UN guiding principles? And the result of which was the Children's Rights and Business Principles. These were developed in 2011 and in a collaboration between the UN Global Compact, UNICEF and Save the Children. And these 10 principles allow companies to identify and mitigate the risks adverse risk on children's rights. So then I come to my second poll. And the question is, some people have already answered it. I see. Have you utilized the children's rights and business principles in your investment policy? A lot of people weren't aware of the children's rights and business principles. I'm actually glad that people have the courage or the honesty to tell this audience, because it only kind of emphasizes the need for the thematic framework that we developed as part of the Covenant Agreements. And actually in the framework, you can read a lot more about it and also how to apply practically. So again, I encourage everyone to go ahead and indulge yourself in the world that's children's rights, starting with a thematic framework. And I also actually see that one answer says, yes, we integrated the CRBBs, which makes me quite happy. All right, that's it for on my part. Now we'll actually go into more detail regarding one aspect of the children's rights, which is child labor, or it is not a right, it's actually a violation of the right. And I wish to introduce to the virtual stage Aki de Kort. Welcome, Aki. Can you maybe shortly introduce yourself, what it is you do, and what makes you an expert on this theme?
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aki de Kort. I'm working for HIVOS in the Stop Child Labor Coalition. And we are part of a broader alliance with Save the Children and UNICEF. And the program we are running together is Work No Child's Business. I'm in the field of child labor for more than 25 years. I've been living abroad for 21 years. I've been working for the ILO, for the child labor program, and now since 8.5 years already for the Stop Child Labor Coalition at HIVOS.
Wow, that's a very impressive resume. Thank you, Aki. My first question to you, I'm going to also put to all the participants, so we have again a new poll for you in menti.com, and this is the question: what do you think are the most important causes for child labor? It should also pop up in this screen, and you have the choice between different options. Is it lack of living wage, the lack of education? Could it be migration, discrimination, or other cultural norms? Or is it all of the above? Aki, can I invite you to reflect on this question? What do you think are the most important causes?
Yeah, I think it's true. It's all of the above. There are many issues that children do work, and I think it's always very important to look at the root causes. Why do children work? And what you often see, and what is easily to say, it's because of poverty. And I would like to unpack the poverty, because there are root causes who are causing child labor. There is a mix of factors that pushes children into child labor. For example, the norms, traditional and cultural practices that are harmful for children, poor education systems, for example, not enough and well-trained and female teachers, weak enforcement system, social exclusion and discrimination, migration, lack of decent work for adults, and I can go on. So that's why I say, it's more than one factor that plays a role why children are pushed into child labor. And what is very important is that we try to break that cycle of poverty and really work because child labor keeps children into poverty, and we have to get out of it, and we have to see how can we do that. Can we get children out of work and back to school where they can learn? And that is, I think, very important. And of course, it goes together with other factors. You cannot only work on getting children out of work and back to school. You need then to train also the teachers. You have to work with the local government and with the national government to see that there is enough infrastructure and that the schools are child friendly, so that children like to go to school and that parents see that children learn at school. That's a good place to be. Law enforcement is very important, and so there are many factors that you have to work together on to combat child labor, and we all have a role to play there. That's not only a company in their supply chain. If there's child labor, a company cannot do this alone. We need to work together with the civil society, with trade unions, NGOs, and with the government.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of very interesting things, and I think in the short answer you give, you also kind of sketched a picture of how complicated actually and complex this situation is. I do want to kind of ask you a question on something you said, because you said that if the children keep working, if child labor keeps persisting, then it's impossible for the children to kind of escape poverty. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I think if children don't go to school and start working, they give it through to their own children. So if they grow up, they are not educated. So they don't know better than, as a child I worked. So our children can do the same. So you keep on going, and you need to break that cycle. And it's a basic right. It's the basic right of a child, the right to education. If we talk about human rights, it's the first right of a child to get education. So it's very important to make sure that children get out of work and get back to school. And in school, they should learn. It should be conducive. There should be a child-friendly environment. Parents need to be on board, that they also see that it is joyful for the children to go to school.
Yeah. And you already started a bit to answer the next question that I had, is how do you start with eliminating such a complex problem? And maybe you can specify a bit the role of companies.
Yeah, I think what is important as a company is, it of course, there are so many different companies. You have multinationals and you have local companies, and you have companies who do source from certain countries and work with their smaller companies. You also, for example, if you have coffee, it comes from farmers, from individual farmers. So it's the family-owned farms. So there are so many different ways of working with companies, but what is important is, if you work in a certain area, that you work with all the actors in that area. So, for example, the coffee, if you work with a coffee company and you have a certain area where you want to work on child labor, but there is, for example, also tea, bring also the tea company on board, and bring always the government on board. And of course, the civil society. You have to work together, and each of the actors have to understand their role. And you play your role. As a company, you're not going to build a school there because you think we source coffee there. So if we make sure that in that area where we source coffee, we make a school, those children go to school, and we are ready. No, that's not it. It is the responsibility of the state to have schools there. Of course, we can help and support. We can try to look, why is there no school? Why are the schools not good there? What should we do to help, to support the government to make sure that there is education? And the same is for living wages. You as a company can say, in the area where we source, we make sure that our workers get a living wage. That's not enough, because the people around it don't get a living wage. So you don't solve the problem. You need to solve it and to look at the root causes and do it together, and make sure that you take all people together in the interventions.
And you have a lot of experience with trying to do this kind of multi-stakeholder approach. Can you maybe, because you already mentioned coffee, for example, and I know that you have extensive experience of working to eradicate child labor in the coffee sector. How how did that go? How did you kind of make that work? And are there any elements of success that you can mention?
Yeah, we definitely have some elements of success, but the first thing what I would like to say is what you need is patience and time. Don't think you can do this in a year, because what you're going to do is to change norms of people, attitude change. They all need to believe that together we can do it. We can make sure that our children don't work but go to school. So you need to start with awareness raising. You need to start with making a situation analysis to know what is the scope in an area, what kind of forms of child labor are there, how do people think about education, how do people think about child labor, how is their attitudes about that. So there is a whole process of awareness raising, of getting a better idea what is happening. And then you can use different approaches. And the approach that we really have a lot of success with is the area-based approach towards the creating of child labor-free zones. So an area-based approach means that if you work in the coffee, you don't only work with the children working in the coffee sector, but you work with all children in that area, because all children have a right on education. Why should you only work with the children working in the coffee? If you use that area-based approach, you also avoid that children are moving from one sector to another. Because if you work on the coffee sector and you make sure that children are out of the coffee, they might move to another sector, or they might move to the informal sector and even be worse off. So that's very important, to make sure that you take all the actors, all the stakeholders and all the children on board. So it's a long process, and you need to work together so that the local government knows their role to play, that the company knows what their role, society knows. So you have to work together. What I can do, I will put in the chat a link to a video of 6 minutes from this child labor-free zone approach with a multi-stakeholder approach in West Nile, Uganda. It might help you to see it. And all these different actors are explaining what they are doing, what role they play in the field. And it's quite nice to see, and it helps you to understand a little bit better how you can work together towards getting children out of work and back to school. Another thing that I can also post in the later on in the chat is an article that was posted 2 days ago in the Serre magazine on the textile sector. We did a project, an RPO project in Bangladesh and India in the textile sector with 6 textile companies, big companies, and they are explaining their lessons learned, and it was a long process as well. And in the interview, it's not that long, it's 1.5 pages, and it explains the 5 most important lessons that we have learned. And I think that's also nice to read through. So I will also put that in the chat later on, so that you have some materials to look at and to get a better idea on how a multi-stakeholder approach can work.
I think that's very, very helpful. Thank you already for putting links to more information. I was wondering, because it's, we're here with the pension funds. For them, I guess it's not, they don't have such a direct link to the areas themselves, but they, of course, invest in companies that do. How do you see kind of the relevance for this issue for the pension funds?
Yeah, I think it's important just to get a little bit more an idea how such things can work in the field. And for a pension fund, I think, what is important is to get into dialogue with your investors and with companies about their due diligence and their role they can play, for example, to combating child labor. I think it's important to understand that each actor has a responsibility, and that we have to make that part of our business policies and practices. So I think that's important from the point of view of the pension fund, that you work in that way with your investors and with companies.
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
Certainly. Thank you so much. I think it actually provides us with a great bridge to the next speaker, because
Exactly.
Stina is the one who has actual experience, hands-on experience on doing the dialogue. But first, I want to thank Aki for shining a little light on the issue of child labor. Of course, it's only a short introduction, so we are very thankful that you provide the links in the chat if people want to learn more about and understand more about how to combat child labor. But thank you, Aki, and then I wish to now invite Stina to the virtual stage. Welcome, Stina. Can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So Stina Nilsson, working at Sociaal-Economische as an engagement manager, and have been doing a similar role both in Sociaal-Economische and in a previous company before for about 10 years, and actually almost since the very start in this role, I've been engaging the cocoa industry on child labor, and also on broader human rights topics as well. So human rights have been the focus of this engagement work and dialoguing really with companies on various human rights topics.
Yes, exactly, because we all know that the jargon for dialogue is engagement. And you are actually leading an engagement, a collective engagement on child labor in the cocoa sector in Ghana and Ivory Coast. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, maybe to start sort of to speak to a little bit, I mean, why do we do this? And obviously, I mean, this is, I think many of the pension funds and participants here will recognize this issue. It is really an extensive and also very well documented issue in cocoa farming, both in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, also in other countries, but mainly those two countries, which also produces almost 70% of world's cocoa production, actually. So they're of course really big players in that sense on the global market. And we have had actually a recent report from October this year pointing to and a large-scale survey which the report is based on, pointing to that about 1.5 million children are actually in child labor in the cocoa growing communities in Ivory Coast and Ghana alone. So obviously big challenge. And of course, I mean, from a pure sort of moral standpoint, I think everybody can understand, why we would engage on this particular topic. Of course, it's also linked to I mean, we see that that investors and I mean certainly all leading responsible investors would have some type of policy saying that they would invest according to international human rights norms. So from that point of view, this is of course a very salient issue. So we have a big group of about 40 investors, institutional investors, supporting and being a part of this particular engagement. And we also, I mean, I also wanted to point to that we see that we have, with that, a lot of leverage, and we actually have evidence even that we have had an impact through the engagement. So that's, of course, I mean, another thing that keeps us going, knowing that it's impactful.
That is very good to hear. I was just wondering, you say 40 investors are participating. Any pension funds?
Yeah, no, certainly.
Okay.
Definitely several pension funds. And I mean, we have, I think we have a fairly good mix of both asset managers and asset owners. So and also from several different countries. I would say it's still quite European centric. We hope to expand that. But other than that, from several different countries and different types of institutional investors.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. So it's very relevant for our webinar today. I was just wondering, how did you start? How did you start? Because usually we get a lot of the questions, how do you even start embarking upon such a big and complex problem? And Aki also painted the picture how complex it is. So how did you guys go about it?
Yeah, so I think, a number of factors should be taken into account to sort of define the scope. So I think, in the cocoa sector, it's actually there are a few quite big players, for good and for bad. But I mean, in this particular initiative, if you will, or engagement, then it was quite a rather easy pick on sort of what companies to dialogue with. So we simply, took the major players globally, and those that are also listed companies. So Mars, for example, that would otherwise have been in the mix, are not, as they're privately held. So of course they have to be relevant for investors as well. And then of course we think of, okay, what are the causes behind child labor, and from that sort of how can we contribute, what would be our focus issues in the engagement, and then we sort of strategize around that. So we use lots of different engagement methods. So everything from, of course, we have bilateral meetings with the companies, and also with lots of relevant stakeholders, industry initiatives, and we've also twice been on engagement trips. So we've been to the Ivory Coast with a group of investors. We've been to Switzerland, also where many of the cocoa companies are headquartered. And we've done roundtables on solutions to child labor in cocoa. We've issued some good practice materials, and public benchmarking also to put pressure also on the companies. So I think we have different ways to where we can use our influence, and of course we also very much rely on having active investors joining our dialogues. That really helps also, and makes it a lot more dynamic and trustworthy, I think, for from the company side, hearing it directly from what are normally their owners.
Yeah, well, it sounds like this is a huge project, and the kind of activities that you've developed is also very broad, from roundtables to, of course, the engagement talks. I was just wondering, do you set goals for yourself? When is an engagement, when do you consider it a success, or do you kind of just move see how it goes and then adjust your goals accordingly?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and yeah, we do set what we call engagement objectives in the beginning of any engagement project that we do, and this is the case also for this one. So we have 3 focus areas there, which is child labor monitoring and remediation systems, so really systems to identify the actual cases of child labor, and seeing those being remediated. The second, to school. So we heard the previous speaker, of course, speak on that, and we see actually the companies here making quite big contributions in that area. And the last one is more trying to tackle the root causes behind child labor and the poverty challenge, really in Ivory Coast and Ghana. So that's the third area that we focus on, is on living income for cocoa growing farmers. And with those three areas, we basically, those will gather throughout the engagement, have more specified KPIs based on those 3 areas that we continuously follow each individual's company's progress according to, and we report back biannually to our investors on the progress.
Okay, it sounds very good that the goals come from prevention actually up to remediation, that you kind of cover the whole scope. I was also wondering, the companies that you engage with, are they all along the supply chain, or do you actually kind of deal with like the end producer more?
Yeah, so they are, I wouldn't say they're covering the complete supply chain, but we do engage companies that, well, some are traders, some do, I mean, cocoa, well, different parts of the refinement process of cocoa products. And then there are also chocolate brands. So in that sense, we do capture a large part of the supply chain. And I would say the parts of the cocoa supply chain and chocolate supply chain where there are major international companies involved.
And thank you. And you already mentioned also you're looking to kind of expand. How do you expand in geographic sense only, or also along the way expand into different kind of companies that you engage with, or sectors even?
Yeah, no, so of course, I mean, we fortunately we do more than engaging the cocoa sector. I'm actually about to conclude a different engagement project, which goes broader into the issues of child labor and forced labor in the food sector more generally. So there we include more crops also, but still focused on the agricultural part of the food supply chain, because that's where we see the more elevated labor rights risks. And also, I mean, I have colleagues in other sectors as well. I have a tendency to get stuck in the food industry myself, but I have other colleagues, I mean, of course, looking into similar issues in textiles, in extractives. So I mean, definitely we're looking broadly as well, sector in the way we work.
It sounds like you almost got the whole picture. We're actually trying to tackle all of the issues when it comes to child labor. I was just wondering, do you have, like, if a pension fund would come to you for advice, it's like, what can we do and how do we go about it? What would you say?
Yeah, so I can start maybe like drafting some more like high level comments to that, because I mean there are definitely, you know, many different ways to go about it, but I think, you know, I always try to keep the UN guiding principles in the back of my head, and there, I mean, I definitely point to looking at salience and leverage when, you know, whatever human rights or children's rights policy that you would develop as an investor. So I would simply, I mean, well, simply, it's not so simple, but I would look at risk first, and in that incidence as well. So obviously talking about human rights or children's rights risks. And really have a good think of, you know, in your universe or in your portfolios, what type of sectors, geographies, what type of companies would those risks or adverse human rights impacts be the more elevated ones, and basically easier said than done, but start there. And I think, I mean, there are many service providers and other, you know, tools out there that you can use to sort of get to a good, set up a good assessment framework to do that exercise. And then, of course, it's all about priorities from there. So I mean, then based on what your results from the risk, or, you know, looking at incident histories and so on human rights, what can you prioritize? So of course that goes down to, I mean, what capacity do you have as an individual pension fund, and you know, to what extent do you want to involve external players or do this internally, and really look at sort of what is the minimum level that, you know, we should have in place, and then maybe add some more, you know, priorities or themes, or you know, some more focus areas where you can do some more particular work. And I think there it makes, I mean, this we say a lot to companies, please do collaborate when you do that, because that's just, I mean, that's how you get to scale. That's how you're effective actually in building and using your leverage. So I'd definitely then look to, I mean, what, and I know, I mean, many pension funds do this already, but look at what others are doing and how can you best join forces with others.
Yeah.
So salience and leverage are key terms to keep in mind.
Yeah, and because you were mentioning like you prioritize first, but obviously at Sustainalytics you do prioritize the issue of child labor, and just to come back, and maybe it's quite a basic question, but why did you or did Sustainalytics see this as a priority?
So I think, I mean, we do, of course, work in many different other areas as well. But I think, I mean, I can relate and speak on cocoa more particularly, and there I think it really stands out as as I was pointing to in the beginning. It's so well documented, the extent of this issue in the cocoa sector. We also know, I mean, when it comes to child labor, if you look at, any ILO report and you look at, where is the biggest prevalence of child labor in what sectors, you quite soon you will get to the agricultural sector as standing out. So I mean, that was also, why we ended up, putting quite a lot of effort there. And I think, I mean, again, back to your question, I think the extent of the issue here, I mean, we're talking about more than 1 million children, and it has been like that also for many years. That, I mean, in a way, like really clearly states salient rights issue.
Yeah, I think obviously working for Save the Children, I completely agree with the analysis that the child labor is a very salient issue, and so I'm happy to hear that others see it the same way. You actually provided us also with a question to the participants. I think we skipped one poll in between because Tina actually already answered the poll, but that's because maybe I asked the question. No, it's no problem. I also just asked you a very general question, so it made perfect sense to mention the number, because we decided to test you on how many children do you think work in the cocoa sector just in these two countries. So it's the 1.5 million is quite shocking. But we have also another question. It's the first open-ended question. How far along the supply chain does the responsibility of the investors' due diligence lie, according to you, the participants? So we are quite happy to hear what you think. Where does your responsibility begin or end in this regard? Maybe in the meantime, Stina, is there anything that you haven't yet told the participants in this webinar that you still want to get off your chest?
Well, yeah, maybe one thing actually, because I was thinking about that as Aki was speaking, and that's what she was pointing out like several times, that that collaboration to get to remediation is really important, and I'd like to just underscore that point again. And I think, I mean, what we see, so I mean, we see many actually quite advanced companies in the cocoa sectors working really actively to address child labor on the ground in cocoa growing communities. And I think quite an interesting development is that we're starting to hear more and more that they are looking at sort of what are other sectors and key industries in these areas. So be it mining, be it coffee, be it rubber, what are they actually doing, and how can they form cross sector collaborations to improve livelihood for the people in the area. So I think that's a really promising development, and something that I think we should also be picking up more. So that's something that I'll definitely bring into next year's engagement.
Oh, well, this is great to hear that you are already seeing some broader awareness of this area-based approach in your own work. I think that's quite encouraging to hear as well. In the meantime, I see some answers are coming in. The companies have effective supply chain management systems that are being audited. The OECD guidelines and UN guiding principles require a risk assessment of the entire value chain. Yeah, can differ per sector, but shouldn't stop at the first tier suppliers. Wow, these are answers that I get happy about. When tackling the beginning of the supply chain, you hopefully have an influence on the whole chain. Yeah, reasonably so. 2 steps with requirement for companies to require the same from their suppliers. Yeah, so you kind of demand every step to kind of push the question back further into the supply chain. All right, I think this is about the answers we're going to get from this question. Do you want to comment on those answers, Tina, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm really pleased to see them, and I must say slightly positively surprised that it's so clearly that I think, I mean, at least all respondents here have pointed out that they see the responsibility as going further than like just the company itself. I agree. I mean, I also get, of course, with saying that it is tricky to get to the down the supply chain and to the many tiers in it, but I think some of the work and work of others as well show that it is possible there. So I'm very happy that people haven't given up on that, but really want to as it seems here, push for that to be the level of responsibility. And I think, from going back to the UNG piece again, I do think that they also put a lot of emphasis on doing the due diligence and looking at salience and leverage. So of course leverage might be is probably less if you go into the supply chain, but there could be higher salience of the issue, which is definitely the case when looking at food companies and the agricultural part of it, as opposed to their own operations. Same in textile, in the ITC sector, for example, and minerals and metals in cell phones, etc. So I'm really pleased to see what the respondents have shared here, and from the salience part or perspective, it really makes good sense, I think.
Yeah, I'm also actually quite pleased with that. So we've come. I'm kind of, thank you very much actually for answering my questions, but we're not done yet, because now it's up to the participants. And they've put forward questions. How can a pension fund measure or view the impact any regulation or action has on eradicating child labor practices? This is an excellent question, but I think also a very difficult question. I think Stina is probably the most apt to answer this one.
I think the best I can do is to maybe point to some examples. I mean, I wouldn't be able to have provide any more precise answers as to how to measure it more exactly. But I think, what I see when engaging companies, and having in mind the various human rights due diligence type of regulations that we see in not the least in many European countries, and I think are probably underway on EU level as well. I do see that companies are picking those up, preparing, and in countries where they have been present for a while, I think it has to some extent raised the bar, at least in terms of having policies in place and doing risk assessments. I'm a little bit more concerned on getting to mitigative and remedial parts of it. So I think there is more to wish for. But I do think it has played quite a significant role in raising the bar in that sense. But that's probably the closest I can get in a response.
Yeah, I can understand. It's also that is another field that might be a bit out of your field of expertise, and it was an excellent question, but a very hard one. We have another question. How can you conduct proper due diligence in a supply chain when making investments on the scale pension funds do? I'm not sure. On the scale, yeah, it's a large scale, I assume, because the pension funds do have quite a lot of financial leverage. But I'm not sure if that's actually what is meant by the question. Yeah, Stina.
Yeah, no, I can give it a go if you want to.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no. So I think I think it's almost an impossible task to ask, a pension fund to do due diligence of, all portfolio companies' supply chains. So I would probably, I don't know if I'm interpreting the question correctly here, but I think I would start a bit more high level. So looking at what type of industries, what type of issues, what type of geography stands out, and then look at more industry level, do more industry level risk assessments and sort of group companies, type of companies together based on that. And then I think it is, if you then, choose to prioritize certain companies over others, or if you do, engagement as a result, then I think you can, this is more sort of points to push the companies on, I think, rather than the investor doing the actual due diligence of a company's supply chain. But again, I'm not really sure. I hope I'm interpreting more or less the question correctly.
I think you did, but if not, the poser can maybe rephrase if he's not satisfied with the answer, and we can maybe see it later. Just also in the meantime, if we have more questions than we can answer in the webinar, then we'll provide you with a written answer. So don't feel disappointed. You'll get your answer anyway. And then I think we can move on, because I still at least 6 other questions, if I'm not mistaken. Aki, could you say something on where you see the most important pinch points for investors to make a change, knowing that investors invest in a range of companies around the globe? Aki.
Yeah, I think here what's important is to look at companies' due diligence. How are they doing their due diligence on the child labor issues? Specifically, are investors or companies making any policy on child labor? How do they work with their supply chain and with the lower tiers maybe? Bring some information on child labor, make them more aware about it, about the risks of child labor, and what kind of harm it can bring to the children and to the communities. I think more in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I have a. Oh, sorry.
And of course, if you want to go further down, yeah, that is always a good thing to see if you have your suppliers from your company in areas where you source products, to see if they can be part of a multi-stakeholder approach to combat child labor.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add, Stina?
No, I think I'll pass on this one.
All right. To both speakers. Should investors also engage with the governments on child labor? I think that's an excellent question. What do you think, Aki?
Yes, I think you always should engage with governments, but governments have really a responsibility on child labor. And what I explained earlier, especially on education. I mean, there's a government's responsibility, but governments also have a responsibility, for example, here in the Netherlands, on due diligence. And on we have this child labor law in the Netherlands for companies. So definitely governments in all kinds of countries have a role to play. And I think you should engage with governments. Yes.
Actually, that kind of gives me a follow-up question to you, Aki, because you mentioned the law that we have. It's not yet, it's democratically adopted, but it's not yet in place. We're talking here about the Wet Zorgplicht Kinderarbeid. Do you already see in your contacts with companies that they're starting to prepare for the legislation?
Yes, I think they do, and especially the companies that are part of the covenants. They are very much aware about it, and they do work on the due diligence and on the different steps they have to take. And child labor is part of it. So yes, but there is also not enough clarity yet on how they will implement this, and if it will be a child labor law or it will be a broader due diligence law. So that's still the discussion that is going on. But definitely, we need all to take our responsibility. Yeah.
So you're saying even without implementation of the law, we need to kind of tackle this issue. Yeah. Stina, do you guys in your COCO project, do you also engage with governments?
Well, I think we would regard them more as sort of, taking in the perspectives of, developments, legislation, etc., and government policies more in general. So be it, in the cocoa producing countries or at EU level, and as Aki also points to in the development of legislation here. So it's, in that sense, we sort of, definitely look at sort of the voice of the government, and of course it has an important role. I think what we also have done together with a number of other investors is also to sign investor statements and letters to governments to implement those type of human rights due diligence legislations. And I will actually be looking into the EU developments more in detail next year when it comes to cocoa. So I think we've done it a bit. I think we probably on cocoa will be doing it more next year. Of course, it could also be sensitive sometimes for investors, when there are national pension funds and so on. It would be inappropriate to I think in some cases maybe to engage their own government in that sense. But that, of course, is definitely not the case for all.
All right, thank you so much. I think now we still have time for maybe one more question. I'm kind of pushing the time here. I hope you guys don't mind. So the last question, engagement on child labor in the cocoa sector has been going on now for many years. As FNV, which is one of the main trade unions that we have in the Netherlands, we have been involved over more than 10 years, and results have been disappointing so far. So it's not an actual question, but I think, Stina, are you disappointed yet or not? And do you see the light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, no, I think you can't be anything else than disappointed when there is still more than 1 million children, of course, still involved in child labor in this sector alone in the two countries. With that being said, so I think there, I would need a little bit more time to, dig more into this, but there have been, I'm seeing quite a significant change. So when we started almost 10 years ago engaging companies on this issue, they said it wasn't their responsibility. It was too far from them having an actual leverage in their supply chain. It was very defensive dialogue. And that has completely changed. I think also in the area of living income, I remember participating in multi-stakeholder settings just 2-3 years ago, and the companies were basically at the back of the room listening to the conversation, and now we see them actually, being in the forefront and trying to actually push and see how they can actively contribute. So where I completely agree, it's disappointing that it's still such an extensive issue. I'm also actually quite hopeful, and see that it's so much more mature in the type of measures and understanding that the companies now have on what needs to be done, and that so many more stakeholders also involved in the doing and in the monitoring of what the companies are doing. So that makes me more hopeful.
Well, I think it's very good to end on a hopeful note. I see that Aki also has something to add.
Yeah, and FNV is posing this question or this statement. Now, FNV is part of the Stop Child Labour Coalition, FNV Mondiaal. And I think they can be very proud because they have a very good partner in Ghana. That's GAU, the General Agricultural Union. And they are really the front runners on child labor-free zones. And they have done this also in the cocoa sector, and they have gone far with it. And they published a video on that, a few minutes, a few weeks ago. And it is very encouraging. And they really make a difference because they really tackle child labor at the root causes. I tried to look it up and post it or send it to Josje so that you can send it to you all. You should have a look at it. Even Stina, it might be very interesting for you as well. So yes, I know it is disappointing still. There's still too many children working. But I also heard that the cocoa sector is expanding. And that was what I was working on a project in Ghana recently with some companies, and they were saying, because of the COVID, the child labor is increasing, and they were saying, no, it's not only on the COVID, because schools have reopened in Ghana, and it's not only that, it's because the sector is expanding, there are much more cocoa plantations and cocoa farmers and whatever, so that means that child labor is also increasing of that. It's no excuse at all. But that's how they explained it.
Well, even a more hopeful note. Well, at least FNV can put this in their pockets, as we would say in Dutch. I will stop here. I think what we've learned, especially in the last comments, is that actually what Aki said right in the beginning, that it's a very long process and it's a lot about awareness raising, and at least. With investors and other companies, this awareness of the problem is present, and they're proactive in trying to eradicate the problem, which I think is hopeful for us all. And I would like to end on a note. I want to thank everyone who participated, and a special thank you again to Aki de Kort and Stina Nilsson for sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And there's nothing left for me to say then. Have a very nice evening, and thank you again for joining us.